Okay, this biology session is going to be about chapter 21 in your textbook on protists and fungi, and it's going to cover all the sections of it. If you're here live, you can ask questions. If you're on a computer, you should see a little speech bubble icon, or on a phone or a tablet, a question mark icon. And you'll just click on that, and it'll bring up a place where you can type in your questions. So don't hesitate to ask questions. You're not going to interrupt. I'll just stop every once in a while and look if you want me to go back over anything, or you want me to repeat anything, or explain something different, or you have a related question, whatever. Just ask any relevant questions you have. Okay, so we're moving up in complexity. The last chapter was about prokaryotes. That's cells that don't have a nucleus. That's bacteria and archaea. And now we're moving up into protists. And protists are different than any of the other kingdoms that we have, in that protists are not organized the same way as the other kingdoms. They're not necessarily closely related to each other. Anything that has eukaryotic cells, which are cells with a nucleus, and is not a plant or an animal or a fungus, is called a protist. And there are about 300,000 species of them. Now, these different groups are very different from each other, even on like a molecular and cellular level. So a lot of biologists argue that it doesn't even make sense to call all of these things one kingdom. And we have about 6 major groups of protists, and some people think they should be classified as 6 different kingdoms, which would pretty much double the amount of kingdoms that we have. But for now, they're all lumped together into that same group that we call protists. So describing protists is very hard because they're so different from each other. Most of them are single-celled organisms, like this one. Some of them live in colonies, like these volvox here, where each of these spheres is made of thousands of individual protists that live together. And some are actually multicellular organisms, such as kelp. Kelp is the large seaweed that, to the untrained eye, just looks like plants growing in the ocean. But on the cellular level, they're actually more like some other protists than plants. So most protists are one single cell, yet they move, they respond to their environment, they reproduce, they take in and use energy. We're going to talk about different ways that they move. So amoebas move by changing the shape of their cell. They send out what's called a pseudopod on one side, which means fake foot. They just kind of reach out a leg, and that extends in the direction that they want to move. And then the cytoplasm flows into the pseudopod, bringing the rest of the cell with it. Some protists have specialized microtubule structures for moving. They have cilia that are short and have many working together, or flagella, which are longer and each cell only has 1 or 2. And then there's other protists that don't move on their own, but they just let themselves be carried by the wind, by the environment, by the wind or the water. They can't move on purpose, but they let themselves be moved. So you should know these 3 different ways that the cells can move on purpose: the pseudopod with the amoebas, the cilia, and the flagella. Reproduction is another area in which there's a great variation in protists. Some reproduce asexually through cell division. Some reproduce sexually using an alternation of generations like plants do, which you'll learn a lot more about in the chapter about plants. And some reproduce asexually, but then they use conjugation to exchange genetic material, just like bacteria do that we described in chapter 20. Okay, we've also learned in previous chapters that organisms can be heterotrophs, meaning they need to get food from their environment, or autotrophs, meaning they use energy to make their own food. Okay, sorry about that. Um, So autotrophic protists, they make their own food from sunlight. They use sunlight and photosynthesis to create molecules that store energy, just like plants do. And autotrophic protists are important ecologically. They're the phytoplankton in the ocean, and phytoplankton are just small, tiny little algae that kind of float around near the ocean surface during photosynthesis. And because they're making food and storing all this food energy, they're the basis of all the ocean food chains. They take sunlight and turn it into molecules that could be used for energy. And so then very tiny creatures eat them, and those provide food for bigger creatures, and so on up the food chain. But also pretty interesting, the biggest creatures in the ocean, which are baleen-type whales, they just eat the phytoplankton. So they, they skip over the rest of the food chain, and even though they're enormous, they spend all day just eating these tiny little plankton filtering through their baleen. And autotrophic protists in the ocean have a bunch of other important roles. They recycle waste, they support coral reefs, and they provide shelter for animals in the form of algae. So we don't really think too much about protists in our daily life, but they really are really important to the world and ecology. They provide the basis for the food chain and really support the oceans. We couldn't have any life in the ocean without them. Then we have heterotrophic protists. They get their food from their surroundings. Amoebas surround their food, take it into a vacuole, and digest it. If you happen to have 2 minutes to spare, go to this link and just watch this amoeba eat food. I won't be able to share it on this because it's owned by someone else, so I can't just stick it into my video, but you should definitely just go watch that and be amazed at this amoeba. Ciliates, which are protists that are covered with cilia that help them move around. They do a similar thing. They have a dent in their outside edge called a gullet, and they move food into that and then pretty much do the same thing. They close around it and make a little vacuole filled with food on the inside. Slime molds decompose matter in their environment for food, similar to a fungus. And let's just take a minute to elaborate on slime molds. Your book doesn't really talk about them very much, but they're just really crazy. Varieties of slime molds are found all around the world on all 7 continents, and despite their name, they are not fungus. So most molds are fungus. These are not. They're protist. And they're really weird life cycles. They start as single-celled organisms, but when they run out of food, they need to go somewhere else where there's more food. So thousands or hundreds of thousands of them join together, and they either fuse to form one giant cell with thousands of nuclei, or they form a colony of individual cells, but they stick together and work together. And when they all join together, they can more efficiently move to a new location to find food. And when they get there and they find a nice supply of food, they grow structures that release spores, which start again as single cells. Okay, and they are pretty crazy. A slime mold can reach out in search of food and then contract back away from the areas with no food, but leaving branches on each patch of food that they find to shuttle nutrients around to the rest of the colony. And slime molds can learn to react to stimulus in their environment and then join a bigger blob of cells and teach the new blob the reactions they've learned. So they don't have brains or nerves. Scientists don't even know how this information is stored, but somehow they're able to pass that information on with some sort of biochemical messaging. Um, Another neat video, if you go to YouTube and search mold time-lapse BBC 1 and you spell mold with a U like the British, you could watch one in action, just a time lapse that just shows it growing and moving around. It's neat. And one really thing that they do to study slime molds is they have them solve mazes. So this is a maze where they filled it up with slime mold. So all the yellow is a slime mold. That is a big colony of these organisms. And then they put food at the beginning and the end of the maze. And it shrinks away from all the paths that don't have food. So like there's no slime mold up here. It left. And down here, it just left. But it left this entire path connecting the two paths of food. And what's really crazy is if there's more than one path, it'll take the most efficient one. Okay, so in this one, there's two paths going from, if this is the start, there's two paths going to the end over here. And the slime mold was somehow able to figure out that this red path is long and it should avoid that one and just stick to that green path because it's the most efficient way to get the food around. So I just think these things are crazy because they don't have brains. They are single-celled organisms and somehow they're able to do this sophisticated kind of communication with the rest of their colony. Okay, so back to what they were actually talking about in your textbook. Remember from chapter 4 that symbiosis is a relationship in which two species live closely together for most or all of their lives. If they both benefit from this arrangement, it's called mutualism. If one benefits and the other is harmed, it's called parasitism. So an example of mutualism with protists is the ones that live in termite guts that help them break down cellulose. So termites eat wood, but they can't actually digest the wood on their own. Most animals can't digest cellulose. They need help from bacteria, or in this case from protists, that live inside the termite's guts and help them digest. So it's helpful for the termite because they're helping them digest and getting something out of this cellulose, this wood. And then it helps the protists because they have a safe home and a supply of food from the termite. But sometimes one of the two types of organisms is benefited and the other is harmed. That's called parasitism. And there are parasitic protists. They cause diseases in their hosts. There's examples of humans. Malaria and African sleeping sickness are two diseases in humans called by protists. So this picture is a Plasmodium protist that causes malaria that's inside of a mosquito and it's ready to be transmitted to a human. So if the mosquito bites the human, the protist ends up in the human's body and then they have malaria. And the last section of this chapter is devoted to an entirely different kingdom of life, fungi. So you may be familiar with fungi as mushrooms and yeast and mold. They're all examples of it. And how we define fungi, they're organisms that produce enzymes that digest food outside of their bodies and then absorb the nutrients from the digested food. So if you want to eat, you have to put the food inside of your mouth and then it goes inside of your stomach and you have all your digestive enzymes in there that break down the food for you. A fungus just kind of lays on top of something and pumps out digestive enzymes outside of it. And then once the food is digested, it sort of just absorbs it into its cells. They also have chitin in their cell walls, so that's an important distinction. So we kind of think of fungus as being similar to plants, right? You've got trees and flowers and plants outside, and right next to them you have mushrooms growing, and they seem similar as far as we can tell. But they're actually pretty different. For a lot of reasons. So fungi don't really use photosynthesis. They have to get their food from somewhere else. They're heterotrophs. And they do have cell walls, but they have chitin in it, which is something that plants don't make, but some animals do. Things like insects, they have those shells that are made of chitin. So fungus has that substance in their cell walls instead of cellulose that plants have. So in some ways, the cells of a fungus are a lot more similar to animal cells than to plant cells. Okay, so those are the important characteristics of fungus. Now, these are one of the kingdoms. So we have kingdoms that are bacteria, archaea, protists, fungus, plants, and animals. So even though we're only spending one section talking about fungus, they are an entire kingdom. Now, there's a variety in fungi too. They may be one cell, like yeast, or many-celled organisms, like mushrooms. And the body of many is made up of hyphae, which are long, slender filaments of connected cells. Mushrooms actually mostly grow underground as a mass of hyphae called the mycelium. So what we see on top of the ground is just the fruiting body of the mushroom. So it's only a tiny part of it. And it's not really like, in this picture, you might think it's kind of like trees and roots, right? So we have a tree above the ground and then we have the roots underneath it. But it's not really like that because the roots are just one specialized type of tissue in the tree, and that's not the majority of the tree. But with fungus, that's not how it is. The mycelium on the bottom is the majority of the fungus. That is what the organism is. It's made up mostly of mycelium. That's how it grows. That's where it lives. The part that comes out of the top is just the reproductive organs. So what we're seeing growing out of the ground is just what is called the fruiting body. It's the part that releases spores, and that's its only job. And then those spores go into the ground and grow more mycelium, or grow more hyphae that become part of the mycelium. Now, most fungi have two phases, a diploid phase that has two copies of DNA and a haploid phase that only has one copy. So you will need to know these words, diploid and haploid. So diploid has two copies of DNA and haploid has one. They switch back and forth between the phases in a process called alternation of generations, which is also something that plants do. We're going to spend a lot of time in the plants chapter talking about that. The haploid phase reproduces asexually with spores, and the diploid phase usually reproduces sexually. When the hyphae of a haploid phases meet, they fuse together, forming diploid cells, and these grow into what's called a zygospore, which creates and releases haploid spores, and this cycle starts all over. So this part's the sexual reproduction here, where you've got the two haploid phases. So they each only have one copy of DNA. They meet, and then they fuse together, which forms diploid cells, cells with two copies of DNA. So they're just cycling back and forth between phases that have only one copy of DNA and two copies, and they just switch back and forth. All right, now why are fungi important? Well, many of them feed by decomposing things. They release digestive enzymes onto dead stuff and break them down for nutrients. So like a good example is these mushrooms and other fungus growing on this dead log. So tree falls in the woods, the log is laying there rotting. So when we say rotting, we mean it's being decomposed by bacteria and fungus. So this is really important for cleaning up waste and dead organisms. Otherwise, the world would just be piled high with dead leaves and branches and animals, and it returns the nutrients to the soil so that other organisms can grow. So the fungus and the bacteria, they break the stuff down, and it's releasing a lot of the chemicals, a lot of the nutrients back into the soil so that more plants can grow and more animals can grow and bugs that live in it have a home. Um, if that didn't happen, then things wouldn't be able to grow anymore because a tree would grow and just suck up all the nutrients out of the soil, and there'd be no nutrients left for other stuff to grow. So fungus are really important for that. Decomposers in general play a really important role in the ecosystem in making sure that there's enough stuff for the next generation. Now they can also feed on living things, so you could see living trees that have fungus on them. In that case, they're kind of acting as parasites. And there are also parasitic fungi that only act as parasites. Um, there's ones that attack plants and animals, including some that affect humans. Things like athlete's foot is a fungus that grows on human skin. It's a parasite. And a cool example of symbiosis is lichens. This is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and a photosynthetic bacteria or algae. The two of them always will grow together. That's a symbiosis. They spend their whole lives living together, intertwined. And the photosynthesis from the bacteria or algae provides the fungus with food, and the fungus provides the bacteria with protection and minerals and water because they hold some moisture. And this partnership allows the pair to get everything they need in barren environments, like on top of a boulder or in a desert. So when we learned about symbiosis or succession, when we talked about succession in the ecology unit, we learned about lichens being pioneer species. They're some of the first things that can grow. So something like a big boulder where other things can't grow there. There's no dirt, there's no nutrients. Something like a lichen can, because they grow together, provide everything that they need between the two species working together. They provide everything that they need so they can grow there. And then as they break down and die, they're creating soil so that other tiny little plants can start growing. And then eventually a whole ecosystem can develop. So yay for lichens. Oh, and that's what I just said, that partnership allows them to get everything they need in barren environments. So that is a mutualistic relationship between a fungus and either an algae or a bacteria. And also really important is mutualistic relationship with plant roots. The fungus growing on plant roots is called Mycorrhizae, and it's really good for both species. The fungus brings water and minerals and nutrients to the plant roots. The plant gives the fungus food for photosynthesis, or the plant gives the fungus food that it made by photosynthesis. That shouldn't be for, that should say from. But the image below is showing a model of mycorrhizae where the yellow part is the plant root and the grayish-whitish part is the fungus that's growing around it. So again, this is beneficial for both species, and it's really a useful thing to have for your ecosystem. So that brings us to the end of this section, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact your instructor.